The session is titled Over the Horizon, Emerging Issues in the Zone, which will focus on issues that could emerge in Asia over the long term and their implications on Australian relationships with the region. This session is moderated by Professor Stephen Walt, Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, who is an acclaimed academic and author. So please.
Well, thank you very much. This is my first visit to Australia, and it's a great pleasure and an honor to be invited to participate in this very important conference. The American baseball player Yogi Berra is supposed to have said at one point that prediction is very hard, especially about the future. And our panel is actually going to take up that challenge because, in fact, we have no choice but to try and make intelligent judgments about what could be coming at us down the road, what could be happening in the next 5, 10, or 20 years. We can try to take action to steer those trends in particular directions, but without at least some rough idea of what the future may hold for us, it's very hard to plan business strategy, to plan political strategy, or to be ready when unexpected events actually arise. And I'm pleased that we have a really distinguished panel of people to discuss some of these issues that might be just over the horizon for people in the zone. First, Hitoshi Tanaka, who is a senior fellow at the Japanese Center for International Exchange. Peter Varghese, the Director General of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Australia, and Professor Brahma Chellaney from the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. I want to start off by asking each of the panelists to speak very briefly about what they regard as the 2 or 3 most important medium to long-term trends in this region. Will economics be driving politics for the next 10 or 20 years, or will political events cast a large shadow over current economic relations? How robust is the progress that we've seen over the last 20 years or so? Let me start with Brahma and ask him to tell us what he thinks is likely to happen. What are the big trends for the next 10 or 20 years?
Asia is at a defining moment in its history. The future will not belong to Asia merely because it's the fastest growing continent in the world, where GDP growth still averages more than 5% per year. There are 2 fault lines in particular that are putting Asia's future at risk, especially its sustainable rise. And how Asia is able to address these fault lines will very much shape its future. First, with political integration falling far behind economic integration, the first fault line is represented by the widening gap between economics and politics. Asia is coming together economically, but not politically. Politically, it's becoming more divided. While the economic horse is trying to take Asia towards greater prosperity, the political horse is trying to steer Asia in a dangerous direction. And the slowing of economic growth in Asia only underscores this risk. The second fault line is represented by the so-called history problem, or how the past threatens to imperil Asia's present and future. Asian disputes over territories, natural resources, war memorials, and even textbooks are in one way or the other linked with the history problem. So in a nutshell, how Asia is able to address these 2 fault lines will very much shape its future trajectory. For example, respect for existing borders has to be a prerequisite for peace and stability on any continent. And in Asia, we are seeing these resurgent territorial and maritime disputes. So how Asia is able to address these issues would very much determine its trajectory in the coming years.
Do you think that the disputes about history are reconcilable? Are there mechanisms we could use to try and alleviate or mitigate some of those disputes about how we interpret the past and how we understand it?
Well, Europe has done a good job in turning its back on its ugly past and charting a better future, Asia can actually similarly come to terms with history so that history is not a barrier to charting a better future. Right now, the tendency is to look too much into the past to the extent that it's beginning to define our present and it's threatening our future. Let the past be the past. We should draw the appropriate lessons from the past, but not let the past cloud our assessments and our policy today.
Thank you very much. Toshi, would you?
Thank you. I came all the way from Tokyo through Washington, Germany, Singapore, and Perth. So I'm totally out of the zone. Not entirely sure if I am speaking right English, but yet let me respond to your original question. What are the major trends in the zone? I would pick up three key issues. One, ever-changing power balance in the region. Two, surging nationalism. Three, deepening interdependency in the region. Negative and positive, either way. But let me first address the question of the changing power balance. When I was Director General for Asian Affairs in the Japanese Foreign Ministry, 2001, China was 1/4 of Japan in terms of GDP. Now China surpassed Japan, and I think yesterday's Financial Times talked about that China is going to surpass the United States in terms of the purchasing power, GDP. So it's amazing to see the growth of China. The question we are asking to ourselves, China used to talk that this is going to be a peaceful rise. But when power becomes stronger, then it is very difficult to foresee that indeed rise is peaceful. The question we are facing up with is, since China is run by communist one-party rule, we do not have right predictability into the future. Therefore, we have to be prepared for any type of unpredictable thing. So that is one of the key questions we are going to face up with in the future as well. Probably more so in 2020, when Xi Jinping talks about doubling its economical strength, also per capita income. Probably China will be surpassing United States in real terms. So how to prepare for that? That is the question number one. The second question is a question of surging nationalism and different nationalism. Take Japan. Japanese nationalism is said to be getting higher. Why? Because of the strong frustration we had for the past 20 years. We suffered from what we call lost 2 decades. And it's amazing to see very short-lived government, only lasted for 1 year, 2 years. And not substantive action to get rid of vested interests were taken. So people started accumulating strong frustration. And now you have strong power in the neighborhood of Japan, China, Korea, and all sorts of things. So all the sort of Japanese public frustration were sort of absorbed by much assertive Japan. And Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is indeed a representative of very nationalistic, conservative Prime Minister. So but Chinese nationalism is very different. China is aspiring to be a big power. Because, again, the key Chinese foreign policy is to accomplish what we call new type of major power relationship with the United States. That satisfies Chinese strong aspiration for a big power. Even in the United States, there is a stronger concentration on domestic affairs. And again, their sort of military exposure, their will to use military means at the last resort is declining. So that surge of inward lookingness, in the case of America, it's more to do with isolationism. But yet, those type of public sentiment would for sure affect the region as well. The third element is a positive element, though. There has been a strong accumulation of interdependent relations with China. We talk about a very worsening relationship with China, with Korea, but China is the #1 trade partner for Japan. China is a #1 trade investment partner as well. So this deepening interdependency, we have some promise. So this is a positive element. So the whole question is how to get to cope with the changing power balance, the surging nationalism, and expand interdependent relationship.
I can't resist the temptation to ask you a very provocative question, which we may come back to several times. So given what you've said, would it be better if China's economic growth slowed more in terms of that shifting power balance you talked about and some of the negative consequences? Because, of course, that would have very negative economic consequences as well. But net, what would your view there be?
There are people who talk about huge risk China has. Again, if China fails to produce economic growth rate, say 7%, there is going to be lots of difficult issues arising out of that. Question of income disparity, question of environment, question of the bribes and all sorts of things. But I would like to see China to overcome these issues. I would like to see China reform themselves. At least we hope that China make themselves right in relation to those domestic issues. If China fails to address all those domestic difficulties and also Chinese economic growth went down, I'm very much worried about the consequences of those, the China who failed to manage domestic issues. In that case, probably their nationalism will be targeted to Japan in particular, and not just Japan, but to the rest of the world as well. That is a nightmarish situation. So I would hope that China will maintain their economic growth.
Thank you very much. Peter.
Well, thanks very much. Steve, I think the meta challenge that all of us in the region have, and if you look 10 or 15 years down the track, it'll come into much sharper relief, is how do you maximize your economic opportunity and minimize your strategic risk in an environment where economic growth is fundamentally reweighting strategic relationships? And irrespective of where you sit in the region, I think you have to face up to those sets of consequences. Now, maximizing economic growth is not going to be straightforward, and minimizing strategic risk is going to be even more difficult. Economic growth will turn on the extent to which the region is able to maintain its so far rather proud history of an outward-looking, open economic mindset, one where trade and investment integration grows, and the prospects of that, I think, are reasonably good. The second component of maximizing your economic opportunities is the hard business of economic reform, and this is where I think the prospects are probably less good. There is no major Asian economy, there's no major economy in the region which is not going to face profound structural economic growth challenges. We've seen the politics of growth for decades, and it's been terrific for all of us. The politics of economic reform, I think, is going to prove much more complicated and will put an enormous burden and test the quality of political leadership across the region, and I suspect we'll get a rather mixed outcome. Minimizing strategic risk ultimately will depend on two factors. It'll depend on the quality and the character of the major power relationships, of which the US-China relationship will be the most important, but by no means the only important relationship. But it will also depend to a very large degree on what sort of normative basis in terms of the strategic culture of the region we're going to see. And ultimately, that question will turn on where China's strategic landing point is going to be. Will China land somewhere in the area of a responsible stakeholder, to use Bob Zelik's phrase, or will it be a power acting more in the light of history, which might find the status quo doesn't serve its strategic interests? I don't think we can call how that's going to end. I doubt very much that even in Beijing, there is a clear sense of where China's strategic landing point is. And in a sense, that's a good thing, because it means that we're operating in an environment which is still a shapeable environment. And to the extent that it's a shapeable environment, it means that the project of building institutions which can reinforce whatever trajectory the major power relationships end up having, building up institutions that can reinforce fundamental norms of behaviour will become even more important. And that's why I think the investment that we in Australia make in the East Asia Summit is going to be a very important one.
Could you say just a bit more about that investment, and in particular what form you think that institution building would take? My read is that there are, in fact, a vast number of institutions throughout Asia, more than I can keep track of. But many of them are not of a particularly powerful or binding character. They're wonderful forums for diplomatic exchange and for talking, but are you imagining these institutions taking on a sort of more authoritative or a greater sense of commitment on the part of the different members?
Well, I wouldn't dismiss the advantage of diplomatic exchange
No,
and talking.
no, not
but,
at all.
Look, there's
even conferences at universities.
There's an alphabet soup of institutions, and we're in our early days of institution building in the region. But I think from our perspective, the institution that potentially has the greatest prospect of being able to bring these economic and strategic threads together is the East Asian Summit, because it has the right membership, its footprint is absolutely right, and it has, at least on paper, a mandate that's broad enough to cover economic and strategic interests. But we're a long way from the East Asia Summit being an effective regional institution. I mean, I'd say we've got the right vehicle, but we certainly don't yet have a navigation system, and that's what we need to be building up.
Nice phrase. I can't resist making two comments. One, I just wanted to comment on Hitoshi's remark about American isolationism, which I think has been greatly exaggerated. I mean, it's possible that that's where the United States will head in the decades to come. I think that's very unlikely. The United States is not withdrawing from world affairs at all. I think the United States is trying to be smarter about what it does and how it uses its power. But just to take it from an Asian perspective, it would probably not have been a good thing for Asia for the United States to get deeply bogged down in a place like Syria. Right? That doesn't actually enhance America's position in Asia at all. It would have detracted from it much the way that the war in Iraq, I think, undermined the American position in Asia and was a large distraction. I also wanted to sort of shift now to thinking about possible game-changing events, and one that occurred while the initial statements were being made was the prospect of economic reform in India and Japan, both domestic economic reform, where I think for the past 20 years people have been waiting for Japan to get its house in order. It may be doing that now. Similarly, we've been waiting for India to sort of fully realize its enormous economic potential. So you could almost look at both ends of the zone here and say one game-changing event would be significant domestic economic reform in these two very large interesting countries that have in some sense been underperforming for a while. So I want to maybe go in reverse order, beginning again with Peter, and just ask, what do you see as possible game-changing events over the next decade or so in this region, things that could alter the trajectory? Just as a comment, if you look at the last 20 years, there have been a number of real surprises in this part of the world, whether it's natural events like typhoons or earthquakes or tsunamis, the SARS epidemic, the Bali bombing, et cetera, things that no one expected to happen, but then have significant, in some cases economic, certainly human, and at times political consequences as well. So I want to invite everyone to discuss what might be the sort of black swans out there that we aren't anticipating. Peter, do you have a favorite possibility?
Well, we're in a place where black swans are the norm, so it's probably probably white swans we should be thinking about.
A white swan is an unexpected positive event.
Well, look, the usual suspects for game changers are something dramatic on the Korean Peninsula, a territorial dispute which, by intent or accident, flares up into a major power conflict. The tanking of economic growth. But if history is any guide, and I think this was a point you were making, the most likely game changer is something which isn't on our list of usual suspects and something which comes out of the blue. I think in terms of the question you posed about economic reform in India and Japan, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Indian election, and I'm sure Brahma would have a good take on this. But India's economic trajectory will always be a case of dancing to its own tune in its own time. I mean, I think we have to think about India with a very large measure of patience. But that said, there is some prospect that if indeed we do see a government led by Mr. Modi, who clearly will have a very strong focus on economic growth and economic reform, whether that focus will be able to sustain the various factors in India that hold back rapid change and rapid reform, I think remains to be seen. But we could indeed be seeing a growth trajectory for India which looks a bit more like what people were talking about 6 or 7 years ago than the performance of the last 3 or 4 years. And I think with Japan, we're all, I think, hopeful that Abe economics will indeed have a significant impact on Japanese growth, and certainly the first 2 arrows of that have had a positive impact, but it's the third arrow, the structural reform, which is always the most difficult, and there I think the jury is out.
Hitoshi?
Well, possible game changers. Clearly, one is lack of better economic performances, in particular in Japan as well. But yet, I think everyone this morning talked about the globalization, interdependence, and sort of thing. Therefore, I think we need to be concentrating on the expansion of the market, not just in Japan, but in the region as a whole. And for that purpose, we would have to push various projects, which is basically rule making, which is free trade agreement. Therefore, TPP is one thing, but at the same time, RCEP as well. Only when we are able to expand the regional market by creating right rules, I think we have less chance of the poor economic performance what to take place. So depending upon what actions each government will take, the economic performance may not become a game changer. But more importantly, since you You ask us to be provocative. Since you ask us to make this meeting interesting, I would like to contradict what you stated in relation to the question of the U.S. posture. Well, I used the word isolationism, but yet watching every day the news from the United States, various arguments from Tea Party, various sort of perceptions on the part of the rest of the world of the President Obama of today. You talked about Syria, you talked about Iran and other places, and I'm sure you admit that President Obama is different from President Bush. I think US is no longer use its military capability as a unilateralist. US will seek for the international coalition. US will probably seek for a sort of division of functions vis-a-vis allies, vis-a-vis friends, and I think those policy, is a good policy, but it may be misunderstood by somebody else who has ambitions to be a hegemon in the region. There is a risk of it. You talked about money changer, game changer. If US fails to act at the moment when everyone appears to be wanting to have United States, that may become the game changer. And in East Asia, we may have that moment. For instance, take the question of Senkaku, and take the question of the Chinese sending ships all the time. I'm very much worried about a possible risk of accidental encounter. And US President Obama did say the right thing when he visited Japan. Indeed, Senkaku is under the Japanese effective control. Therefore, it applies, US-Japan Security Treaty applies. But the question is, would United States act or not? So, given the perception, I'm not talking about real US policy, but given the perception of the United States, there is a tendency in the region and rest of the world that United States may not act at the end of the day. That is something which may become the game changer. But against it, I think the President Obama, for his recent trip to Asian nations, was trying to reassure. It is a trip of reassurance indeed. But yet, again, Japan, Australia, Japan, Korea, United States, India, and all sorts of bilateral, trilateral, kind of minilateral partnerships would provide the kind of reassurance against the possible wrongdoings in the region. But at the same time, don't we need to seek for something like much stronger confidence-building measures? Because we are not talking about enemies. We are talking about the largest trade partner for us all. So why don't we pursue in the real way the creation of confidence-building mechanism, that type of thing? So I think there are several worrisome possible game changers. But if we are able to do something in time for those type of things to occur, we should be okay.
I'm not going to turn this into a U.S.-Japanese strategic dialogue, so I will not answer, at least not yet. But Brahma, please.
Well, in addition to the scenarios outlined by Secretary Verghese and Tanaka-san, I see two potential game changers, one on the geopolitical side and one on the resource/environmental side. One game-changing geopolitical development could be the potential emergence of several independent military powers in Asia, including a resurgent Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and a potentially reunified Korea. With the United States focusing its foreign policy on balancing its relationships in Asia and avoiding doing anything that might raise Beijing's hackles, America's allies and strategic partners in Asia are being forced to accept that they will have to contend with Chinese military incursions on their own. And this is prompting several of them to build credible military capabilities. And the emergence of independent military powers would be a development that would be game-changing, but these powers would remain close friends of the United States. In this sense, they would be following in the footsteps of two of America's closest allies, Britain and France, which, rather than entrust their security to Washington, have built formidable deterrent capabilities. In this context, if I may mention Japan, one of the most far-reaching but least noticed developments in Asia has been Japan's political resurgence. Historically, Japan has always punched far above its weight, a record punctured only by its World War II defeat. But now the Japanese nationalistic impulse, as Mr. Tanaka implied, is reasserting itself. And the return of Mr. Abe to power marked a watershed in Japan's determination to reinvent itself as a more competitive and secure nation. Japan no doubt faces stark choices today: grow or bust, boosted security or come under siege. It has no option but to reflate, become more competitive, and rearm. History will repeat itself when Japan rearms, a profound development likely to gain traction in this decade. Japan's rearming, without its abandoning of the security treaty with the United States, will help boost its GDP and also yield major profits for US defense firms. And the Abe government has already taken some early steps in that direction, including instituting a security review, easing the long-standing ban on export of weapons, and seeking to reassert the right of collective defense. The other potential game changer is the specter of resource conflicts coupled with unchecked environmental degradation in Asia. Historically, access to resources has been a major driver of armed conflicts, including many of the wars of the 19th and 20th centuries. In Asia, the sharpening geopolitical competition over natural resources has turned resource-rich territories into zones of interstate competition and conflict. For example, the disputed Spratly and Senkaku Islands occupy a land area of only 11 square kilometers, but it's the surrounding areas that are supposedly rich in hydrocarbon reserves. Similarly, what is common in the territorial issues over Tibet, Kashmir, the Golan Heights, and Central Asia's Fergana Valley? These issues are as much about water resources as they are about land. We tend to forget that because the spotlight is on Asia's dramatic economic rise, we tend to forget that Asia is the world's most resource-poor continent in per capita terms. This is an interesting statement that I'm making in a country like Australia, which is so rich in natural resources. But Asian economies are tapping the resources elsewhere in other continents, for example, in the resources of Australia, Africa, and Latin America. They can import fossil fuels, mineral ores, but they cannot import water. Water is essentially local and very difficult and expensive to ship across seas. But these resource issues in Asia are creating a triple crisis. The overexploitation and degradation of natural resources is contributing to an environmental crisis. The environmental crisis, in turn, is contributing to regional climate change. In other words, three separate crises which are interlinked: a resource crisis, an environmental crisis, and a regional climate crisis. And the only way we can deal with these three crises is by establishing rules on resource-related cooperation and competition, and by taking a long-term integrated holistic approach to resources. For example, water, energy, and food at the policy level need to be integrated, because these three constitute the resource stress nexus in any region and in any country. So the point that I'm trying to make is that Asia needs to build a more sustainable and peaceful future for itself.
I'm very glad you brought up the environmental issue, because at least for me, one of the big game changers out there would be the possibility of unexpected, sort of worst case environmental change, and in particular for parts of Asia that are very low lying, the possibility of enhanced or increased climate change and then sea level rise has very significant effects for a number of these countries, which then has follow-on effects with migration, refugee flows, and things like that. One very quick question, very short answer. How far do you think Japanese rearmament is going to go?
Japanese rearmament will happen, and happen sooner than most of us realize.
But does that mean 1.2% of GDP, or 2% of GDP, or 3% of GDP?
Oh, well, I think the rearmament will not be measured in terms of defense spending. It'll be the revival of the military-industrial complex within Japan, which in turn will help boost exports, both defense and non-military exports of Japan. And as I said earlier, that even the US defense firms will benefit tremendously from the rearming of Japan.
Thank you.
May I just make very quick?
Very quickly.
If India's militarization level is level 10, Japan is probably level 1 at this juncture, because Japan spent only 0.9% of GDP for its military budget, while China spent 2.5%. Japan doesn't have any power projection capability. Japan doesn't have any long-range missile. Japan doesn't have any long-range transportation and bombers as well. So probably Japan is a nation which has restricted its military capability, while Japan has huge economic capability. So I don't think Japan will go for the status. As you say, militarization is something very misleading in relation to Japan.
Yeah. Can I
Yes,
just
please.
support what Hitoshi just said? I mean, I think it's very important to understand what is and what isn't going on in relation to where Japan is seeking to position itself. I mean, this is not the echoes of the militarization of the 1930s. I mean, Japan is seeking to play a more active role in regional security and beyond, and from an Australian perspective, that's something we have always welcomed. It is seeking to see whether it can resume the right of collective self-defense, which is something which every country takes for granted. I think that's a very long way from a rearmed Japan in the sense of a Japan that has echoes of the 1930s.
I agree with that entirely. So I wanted to turn finally to an issue which I think everyone understands could have an enormous impact on Asia in the years ahead, and that's, of course, the Sino-American relationship. Foreign Minister Bishop earlier today expressed, I think, a rather optimistic vision, quite correctly pointing out that the United States and China have very large incentives to try and keep that relationship more positive than negative. On the other hand, we also know in world politics that countries often do things that nonetheless don't yield all the benefits they might otherwise try to realize. There is often a tragic dimension to all of this. And you see, in fact, we have seen in the past week or two a number of things that look like they could indicate sort of a greater rivalry, greater competition, including, of course, the various commitments that President Obama expressed when he was coming through the region to provide reassurance. I think reassurance that was at least partly directed at the concerns countries in the region have about China. Vis-a-vis Japan, the new relationship we have with the Philippines as well. So I guess the question is, if the United States and China become increasingly competitive, and part of that competition involves competition for influence in the zone, as I believe it will, how are countries in this region likely to respond? How will they manage this trade-off between the security partnership they would like to maintain with the United States and the economic relations that they have with China? And perhaps to be more optimistic than I often am, what steps could we take in the years ahead to minimize the tension between those two objectives? Let me start with Brahma and then work down the panel.
It is noteworthy that China and the United States have diametrically opposite strategic visions for Asia. China seeks a multipolar world, but a unipolar Asia. The United States, the opposite. It wishes to retain a unipolar world while actively working for a multipolar Asia. How do you reconcile these two visions is going to prove problematic for the Chinese and American foreign policies. Yet at the same time, it's worth noting that China and the United States are fairly respectful towards each other. China is careful not to tread on American toes. Its assertiveness is largely directed at its neighbors. At most, China is unwilling to provide support to the United States on major international issues, including Ukraine, Syria, Iran, and maybe even North Korea, but that too in a way that would not roil its relationship with Washington. As for the United States, it has used rising Asian concerns over China to strengthen its economic and strategic partnerships, as was underlined by Obama's new 10-year security deal with Manila. Yet at the same time, we saw Mr. Obama during his recent tour, he went to extraordinary lengths to assure Beijing that his reassurances to American allies during the tour were not directed at China. And his so-called pivot to Asia has remained more rhetorical than real. In fact, there has been a course correction in the pivot policy since it was unveiled in 2011. The two course corrections: one, even a name change. Pivot has been rebranded as rebalancing, and ever since the pivot was unveiled, the administration has bent backwards to tamp down the military components and lay emphasis instead on the economic aspects, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because they realized very quickly that their initial pivot policy put the United States on the uncomfortable path of seeking to take on China, which is not American policy. American policy is to deepen the relationship with China, which has become a critical country for the United States economically and strategically. So looking ahead, I see the US-China relationship remaining uneasy, with aggravated competition or confrontation suiting neither side.
Hitoshi?
Yeah, I think it's wrong to talk in terms of United States, China in a competitive relationship, or United States and China in accommodative relationship. What is more important is probably how to cope with the region itself. It cannot be bilateral, US, China. It would have to be the region. What is the right approach on our part? Japan, Australia, ASEAN, China, Korea. So I would like to see much more deliberate responses on the part of us in terms of functions. Earlier, you talked about the institution buildings, but it turned out to be less promising. I think what we need to be doing is to strengthen different functions, various different functions. For instance, the question of national security, we are bound to be having much stronger alliance relationship with the United States. We are bound to be expanding our partnership arrangement with Australia, with India, and all sorts of things, because we need to be prepared for unpredictability into the future. But at the same time, why don't we expand the function of confidence building alongside with China? Why don't we create, as you say, cooperation for energy? I remember several years ago, 2002 it was, or no, a bit later, I came to Australia, met with Foreign Minister then, Mr. Downer, and begged him to join in East Asia Summit, because we need a little bit wider body in East Asia so that we could talk about, for instance, energy cooperation. If we I mean, East Asia Summit has got everyone, United States, Russia, Australia, India, and others. Why don't we start talking about the best way for us to introduce energy safety, various safety measures for nuclear, civil nuclear development, and all sorts of things. So only when the region start taking precise actions in relation to the question of how to cope with this future uncertainties, particularly caused by the changing power balance in the region. I don't buy the argument that China, United States, since it's going to be competitive, therefore it is getting more difficult for us to manage the region. Instead, I would very much like to see the actions from inside.
Very quickly, if the Trans-Pacific Partnership fails for one reason or another, it doesn't get through the United States, Japan doesn't make enough adjustments, other countries have, how significant a blow is that to the sort of multilateral framework that you're trying to...
Since it is very, very significant, we will not fail.
Very good. Peter.
Well, I think it's inevitable that there'll be elements of strategic competition in the US-China relationship. I mean, the policy question or the policy challenge is, can we ensure that strategic competition doesn't drift into a strategic fault line in the region between the US and China? And I think there are three reasons why that may not happen. The first is there is a certain logic of economic interdependence which tends to work against a strategic fault line developing in the region. Now, this is by no means a guaranteed outcome, and you only have to look at the world before 1914 to see a case study in how economic interdependence ended up in strategic tiers. So I'm not saying there's an iron logic to this, but I think it's a powerful force which would constrain a drift to a strategic fault line. I think the second is, the point that Brahma and others have been making, is that we're going to be dealing with a region which is multipolar to the extent that there are going to be several strong players, not just two strong players. And by having several strong players, I think you make it less likely that you're going to have a binary strategic environment between the US and China. And the third break, in my view, on a worst-case outcome is that China's preoccupations, by and large, are going to remain domestic for a very considerable period of time. That doesn't mean that they're going to abandon strategic issues or strategic aspirations, but clearly the challenges of domestic growth, the challenges of domestic reform, keeping the party's control while delivering economic growth is going to consume a lot of Chinese energy. So I think those three factors, I think, will help push us a bit away from a sharp strategic fault line.
Thank you. It seems to me if you take the discussion we've been having and sort of distill it down, one of the lessons you would draw from it is that the future of relations in Asia will be is not predetermined in any particular way and will be heavily driven by sort of the quality of diplomacy, the quality of statecraft, by the whether or not we have sort of wise, mature, far-sighted, judicious leaders in a number of key capitals, including, of course, Washington, Beijing, Canberra, and others. I want to end, I guess, our panel, because we are about out of time, by asking each of the panelists a question for which there is a one-word answer. And the question is, when you look at relations in the zone, political, economic, and otherwise, over the next 10 or 20 years, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Brahma.
I'm an optimist.
Hitoshi.
I am optimist.
I am as well. I'm an overall optimist.
You've heard it first here. Everything's going to be fine. Please join me in thanking the panelists for a very engaging discussion.